to Job chapter 1. Job chapter 1 is where we're going to spend, the book of Job is where we'll spend a little bit of time this evening. So just in the way of kind of timeline and update, tonight will be my last iteration of this series we've been doing for a few weeks called Asking for a Friend. And the idea behind this, and we will come back to this. So if I didn't get to your question, because I can tell you up front, we got more submissions than we could do this for 6 months straight. We got a lot of feedback, which is fantastic, and I appreciate it. It makes my job a lot easier. But the whole idea was this, of course, was asking questions that maybe we are embarrassed or have never been given a straight answer on. So some of these, kind of fall in those types of categories. We've looked at a lot of things. We've looked at, music. We looked last week, got a really good one, kind of an unusual question, but that's the whole point of this series is, can Christians vote? Can they be involved in the political system? That kind of thing. Next week, Lord willing, Chad will be here. Chad Landman will be here to preach AM and PM, so he'll take this class period, and then Logan has agreed to take the last one of these before we transition into our fall quarter. So again, I hope that these have been a blessing to you, and please continually send me these questions, because we will periodically come back to this series, kind of like the prophets, priests, and kings. It's a great one that we can kind of sub in different places. If we need to fill a gap between two series, we can throw in things like this and kind of get and go all over the place. The question we're going to look at tonight is this: how can I stay faithful when so many of my questions in life go unanswered by God? Sometimes it seems that He is inattentive to my problems. I read this question. In fact, I've had this one on my mind for a few weeks. This was about midway through our series of looking through this. I got this question in, and I thought, this is probably one that many of us are going to connect with and empathize with, right? Another way to phrase this is, what do I do when life doesn't go exactly as I've planned it? And this really goes hand in hand with a lot of the lessons we've been doing recently. So I kind of waited to do it now because we've talked about prayer with the Holy Spirit class. We talked about Samuel and his perseverance through life. But this question does take kind of another unique angle that I want us to look, and I think Job is the perfect kind of character study for us to answer some of this question. I think it's worth saying on the front end that there's some things in life that will go unanswered. God does not promise that we're going to understand everything. In fact, as I've said before, if we understood all the things of God, if we understood all the plans of God, God wouldn't be God. So there are going to be things that we go through life and just don't understand on this side of eternity. And I heard it said one time that on the other side of eternity, we won't care. So there's a lot of things that fall in that category that I'm not going to have all the answers for. But there are other things that we may not get them in the timing that we want. They may not be the answer that we're looking for, but we still have to figure out a way to move forward with faith, right? We have to continue a way to stay faithful to God. So that's going to be the way we're going to look at this question tonight. Job 13 and verse 15, and we, for the sake of time, won't go through the full story of Job, but this is one of my all-time favorites. I'm surprised I've not done a lesson already, because I love the book of Job and kind of come back to it over and over, in spite of the fact that we're pretty sure Job's one of the oldest books written. I think it is one of the more applicable narratives that really you could read through this. There's some really kind of unusual things about it, but the nugget of it is when life doesn't go as we plan, how are we going to handle it, right? And that's a narrative that you and I face every single day. When things don't go our way, when life throws us a curveball, what are we going to do? Job received the ultimate curveball. If you've never studied the story of Job, I'll give you the kind of Cliff Notes version. Job was an amazing man from the land of Uz. He was wealthy. Most people kind of calculate it into the billions by today's dollars. He had a big family. He was faithful to God, and Satan and God kind of convene in this really unique thing. We don't really see any other instances just like this in the whole Bible. But Satan and God convene together, and Satan says, basically, all these people are faithful to you because you continually bless them, and you put a hedge of protection around them. And God says, have you considered Job? Job is a servant of mine, and in spite of any preference that you think I might be giving him, I could take all that away, and Job will remain faithful. And so that's essentially what God allows. He says, don't kill him, but everything else you can take, all his fortune, his children, everything, even his health, you can take it all away. And Job, I'm confident Job will remain faithful. And we go through all of this, and Satan is allowed to test Job. He takes away all of his livestock and property. He takes away his children. He takes away his health. And then we start getting into chapter 3. And Job, chapter 3, and the entirety of chapter 3 is him lamenting even being born. Now, the great thing about Job is Job never curses God, but Job is frustrated. Job doesn't understand why this is happening to him. Right? Probably the response that 99.9% of us would have given his circumstances. So Job experiences a lot of the emotion that we would have. Anger, frustration, confusion. But then when folks would come, he's got 3 friends that kind of stay with him throughout this narrative. We'll look at them more in a moment. He's got his wife. All 4 of them, the 3 friends and the wife, are terrible influences. They give him really bad advice. His wife says, why don't you just curse God and die? Just be over with it, right? At that time, there was a belief that if anything bad happened to you, it was because you had sinned and God had pulled his favor from you. And Job says, no, that's not it. I will remain faithful. The friends give him bad advice. But Job is hurt. And I mention that because, some will look at the story and say, well, maybe Job wasn't even hurting during this time. Somehow, God pulled all this away, but Job really wasn't feeling it the way we would feel it. And we start looking in kind of between the margins of this story, and we recognize that's definitely not the case. Job hurt. Job was frustrated. Job was confused. And again, exactly what we would feel in the same circumstance. But we jump ahead to chapter 13. Just to kind of pick up the story, because Job's a rather long book, and we're not going to read the whole thing. But in 13, it says, though he slay me, this is Job talking about what God had done to him. Though he slay me, yet will I hope in him. I will surely defend my ways to his face. He's talking about this idea of even though God is taking things away, I will remain hopeful in what he has in store for me. And I want to use the narrative of Job, if you'll allow me, to kind of walk us through a little bit of what that means to remain faithful when God doesn't answer or when we don't understand exactly what's going on. Martin Luther King preached some amazing sermons, and if you've never listened to any of them or watched any of them, I'd encourage you to go to YouTube, find some of them. They're fantastic. There's one in particular that I keep a transcript of on my notes section of my computer because of how good it is. The sermon he preached in the late 60s, and the title of it was, But If Not. And it was all around the context of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and King Nebuchadnezzar. Remember, they said, we believe God will deliver us, but if not, I will remain faithful. And he did this sermon, and the context of it is great. It's a rather lengthy sermon. But the core of it that I always read and reread and study is this idea of, do I have a if faith or a though faith? And I want to read you an excerpt. It's a couple paragraphs long, if you'll allow me. But the context that he's trying to pull us to is the faith that we have something where we're saying, God, if you do A, B, and C, if you reveal this, or if you give me this, I will remain faithful to you, right? Or is it a though faith? Even though God may not do those things, he doesn't reveal his perfect will and plan to me. He may not give me the comfort on this side of eternity. He may not do a lot of things. I'm going to remain faithful even though. Listen to this excerpt. But let me move now to the basic point of this message. This is an exact transcript of the sermon that he did. Know this morning, if we forget everything I've said, I hope you won't forget this. It came to the point after saying, our God is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, but if he doesn't deliver us, we still are not going to bow. But if not, do we understand what that means? That these men were saying that our faith is so deep and that we found something so dear and so precious that nothing can turn us away from it. Our God is able to deliver. But if not, this simply means, my friends, that the ultimate test of one's faith is his ability to say, but if not. You say there is what you may call an if faith. And there is a though faith. And the permanent faith, the lasting faith, the powerful faith is a though faith. Now, the if faith says, if all goes well, if life is hopeful, if it's prosperous, if it's happy, if I don't have to go to jail, if I don't have to face agonies and burdens, if I'm not called bad names because of taking a stand that I feel I must take, if none of these things happen, then I'll have faith in God. I'll be all right. That's an if faith. A lot of people have an if faith. Jacob found himself in a dilemma, and his faith was contingent on an if. He said, now if God will be with me and will keep me in this way that I go, and if God will give me bread to eat, then again I will stay within my Father's house. Then shall the Lord be my God. That's an if faith. And then he's going to contrast this with a though faith. This sermon was preached 50, 60, 70 years ago. But I want us to consider where we fall on this spectrum. Do we have an if faith, or do we have a though faith? Because I'm going to suggest to you that the answer to that question will greatly determine our ability to handle the original question that was posed to us, which is, what do I do when God doesn't give me the answers that I'm looking for? What do I do when my prayers, my questions go unanswered? The though faith. There is a though faith. And the though faith, though things go wrong, though evil is temporarily triumphant, though sickness comes and the cross looms, nevertheless, I'm going to believe anyway, and I'm going to have faith anyway. Though the waters there roar and are troubled, through the mountains shake and swell, the Lord of hosts is with us. And old Job got to the point he had a though faith. He looked out, and everything that had been taken from him, even his wife said, now what you ought to do is curse God and die. God has been unkind to you, and you should have left God a long time ago. You ought to curse him and die, Job, because he hasn't treated you right. But Job said, my faith is deeper than that. Though he slay me, yet I trust him. My faith is a though faith. And that is the essence of life and religion. The question is, do we have an if faith or a though faith? I want us to consider the book of Job as we walk through this. Which side of this do we fall on? Do we have a faith that says, God, I'm with you if you fulfill certain criteria, if you check these boxes, if you provide these things? Or is it a God, I'm faithful to you because you created me, because I believe you are the one true living God, that you sent your son for me, and if all this world has to offer me is hurt and frustration and confusion and trial, but I have an opportunity to be with you for eternity, it's still worth everything over and over and over again. That's a though faith, and that's what Job had. Frustration with God isn't incompatible with worship to God. Job exemplified this through his life. There were times where he was frustrated by the circumstances that he lived in, but that didn't make the worship to God happen any less frequently or with any less zeal. We keep looking throughout this story, and I want to look at 3 truths about how to worship God when questions go unanswered. When we try to build the faith that we have to be faithful like Samuel this morning, to be faithful like Job, I think we see 3 things through the story of Job that helps us in these moments when life doesn't go our way. When life is confusing, it throws us curveballs. How do we move forward? One is confession is healthier than repression. Sometimes it takes us being willing to confess to God the frustrations we have, the confusions we have. You know, we think about our prayer life, and again, this goes hand in hand with our morning class. Sometimes we like to pretend like life is perfect. And for whatever reason, we don't come to God with the real, honest prayers that we have. We're so used to giving him the rehearsed, nuanced, kind of polished prayers that it becomes difficult for us to come to God with anything real. To come to say, God, I'm mad. I don't see why you're allowing this to happen. I don't see why this is going on in my life. I don't see why this needs to happen. This is what Job began to do, and God gave him a very direct answer. We're not going to receive that. But confession is part of the healthy process that we can work through, and it's much better than repressing this down inside. Look the way Job handled this in Job 7, verse 11. He says, therefore I will not keep silent. Notice this. I will speak out in the anguish of my spirit. I will complain in the bitterness of my soul. Friends, do you empathize? Do you connect with this kind of language? If you've been around long enough, my guess is that you will. Because we don't have to live life very long to get in a period where we have anguish and bitterness and hurt because we don't understand, we're not getting the answers we need, we're not getting the answers we want. But yet we still offer these very polished prayers to God that God knows aren't really the contents of our heart. Job is looking at this and saying, I'm not going to keep silent. I will offer the prayers exactly as I feel them. And you're going to see the way that God responds is, that's the kind of conversation I'm looking for. That's the kind of conversation I want. Fast forward to chapter 13 and verse 3. But I desire to speak to the Almighty and to argue my case with God. Friends, that's sometimes the way you and I have to move forward when we get in these seasons of, God, you're not giving me the answers I'm looking for. I'm confused. I don't know the step forward. Sometimes it is, God, we got to talk through this. And this is not going to be a polished, Sunday morning type prayer. This is going to be a Job 7. This is going to be out of the anguish of my spirit. This is going to be out of confusion, out of bitterness, after hurt. This is the way that a son is going to talk to a father that feels like they've been wronged. You've probably been there with your own father. You know what those conversations are like. But sometimes, more often than not, they have to happen in order for the healing and the reconciliation to begin. God's no different. Job, if you read through, again, Job's 43 chapters long, it's a long book, you'll recognize that some of these prayers, these are not the prayers that we often pray. These are real, these are gritty, these are hurting prayers. And if you look through the story, the timeline of the book of Job, you get to the end of it, and God rewards Job for the way that he handles this process. How do we know that God is pleased by the way that Job is considering talking, the way that Job is praying, the way that Job is dealing with this situation? Because we get to chapter 43 and God returns everything that Job has had by threefold. He increases his wealth, his children. He gives him everything back because he handled it so faithfully. Offering real prayer to God is not a disqualifier to have a relationship with Him. I think sometimes we think, and there is a fine line between recognizing and offering real prayer and disrespect, and we fear God. We are to fear God and respect God, but the flip side of that is God wants a real relationship with Him. If everything had to be polished, if everything had to be perfectly said, the Pharisees would have been the guy. The Pharisees would have been the one that God was saying, these are my people. But Christ chastised them more than anybody. So obviously this idea of polished prayer, looking good on the outside, being that whitewashed tomb is not what God is looking for. And again, for everybody, there is a difference between being disrespectful, knowingly defiant and disrespectful, and coming to God hurt and saying, God, I love you. I believe you can fix this situation, but right now I'm hurt. I'm bitter, I'm angry. And that's what Job did, and we see Job come out on the other end better because of his way of handling this. We like to pretend like life doesn't hurt and life isn't messy, but it is. It does hurt, and it is messy. God knows that. God doesn't look at our life through this perfect lens where everything is made exactly as we wish it were. God is very aware of the things that we deal with. And just like a father wants his children to pick up the phone and say, call me, tell me what's going on. The good, the bad, the ugly, I'm here to listen. If I can help, I will. Our Father wants the exact same, and it's what Job did through most of the middle chapters of the book of Job. It's this kind of cycle of him listening to these friends, praying back to God, reconsidering. It's just this big cycle, and some of us get in similar cycles ourselves. Number two is that sometimes presence is better than advice. So this is kind of for those that may be helping somebody go through one of these seasons. Sometimes, maybe it's just me, but maybe you feel this way as well. We feel a compulsion to kind of help someone and offer advice, and how do we work through it? Right? We come to somebody that's in a Job type situation, and we say, here's what I would do. Right? For some of us, that's just instinctual. But we look at the way that Job's friends and even his wife handled this, and you recognize that their presence was far more needed than their advice. They needed to be with Job, but Job didn't need what they had to say. Job 42, 7 and 8. After the Lord said these things to Job, so Job, this is almost at the end of the book. And Job had kind of got an earful from God and was listening to all the things that God is planning and went through. And these are the friends that he has. The Lord has said these things to Job. He said to Eliphaz the Temanite, I am angry with you and your two friends because you have not spoken the truth about me as my servant Job has. Because we'll look in a second, they had given every other reason why this must have been happening to Job. Job, you're not spending enough time in Scripture. Job, you're not praying enough. Job, you're not praying to God at the right times. Job, you're not doing A, B, and C. Again, they were going down this rabbit hole of, Job, it must be your fault. God could not have a bigger, better reason why this is going on. Never crossed their minds. Now, take these 7 bulls. This is talking to the friends. Take the 7 bulls and 7 rams and go to my servant Job and sacrifice a burnt offering for yourself. My servant Job will pray for you, and I'll accept his prayer and not deal with you according to your folly. You have not spoken the truth about me as my servant Job has. Again, read through the middle sections of Job. These are not clean, rehearsed, polished prayers. These are hurt-filled, bitter-filled conversations with a dad. But then God talks to the friends and said, Job has spoken truthfully. Job receives my favor. I'll forgive you only if Job prays for you. That's how much I still care and respect what Job says. We look through, and again, this is just off kind of the top of what some of the friends had said to Job. This has happened because you've sinned. Right out in chapter 4, they say, Job, this must be your fault. If you had faith, you'd be healed. They go through this big cycle in chapter 8. In chapter 5, they say, Job, this must be a lesson that you need to be learning. Right? They say, Job, in chapter 22, if you live right, again, this assumption that if you fix this, then God will return your prosperity. Job 15, if you just read more, if you knew more of God's word, if you understood his will better, you'd be fine. God continually looks at them and says, you've spoken nothing but lies. Job has remained faithful during this. Again, not a clean faithfulness, not a polished faithfulness, but a real faithfulness. Just like Samuel in the grit of life, but they remained on God's side. And then number 3, sometimes perspective is more powerful than answers. And this is probably where the point that some of us are not going to like this answer, because again, just by the context of the question, we want God to answer us. We want to know the question, the questions that we have, the things we need. We feel like, God, why don't you answer? But recognize that sometimes perspective, sometimes looking at things as best as we can through the way God may view them is more powerful in the healing and understanding process than if we'd have gotten the answer itself. This is a book written by Joni Toni Erickson, who is a fantastic writer. When she was in her teenage years, she dove into a lake when she was about 12. And she thought the water was a lot deeper, hit her head, and became paralyzed from the neck down as about a 12, 13-year-old. And has written a lot of books and talked about, the majority of her discussion is, what do you do when life just does not go your way? And I mean, she's got a really powerful example of how to do that. But I want you to listen to the quote, only a sentence long, but I've got this highlighted on a sticky note and taped to my computer monitor in my office, because of how often this comes up. She said, true wisdom is believing when all the puzzle pieces don't fit back together. She is a teenager that has spent the first 12 years of her life, like you and me, and has everything taken away. But through all of this, she comes out to the other side and says, true wisdom is recognizing that sometimes the pieces just don't go back. And that's okay. That life doesn't always make sense. We don't always get the answers we're looking for. And like I said, the Christian perspective is recognizing that even if we have all of our questions go unanswered, even if we spend this entire life hurt, confused, persecuted, but we get an opportunity to spend eternity with God, you and I are coming out way ahead. That's not the case for most of us. Most of us have a handful, at best, of unanswered questions that we stay frustrated by. But I'd encourage you to take Job's perspective. You know, we look, and I want to end by looking in Job 38. One of my favorite chapters in all the Bible, Job 38. So we're towards the end of the book of Job at this point. And God has now answered Job. We'll start in I put verse 2, but we might as well start in verse 1 and read down through verse 11. And I encourage you to read all of 38 on your own, because this is God responding after cycle of questions and hurt, and the friends giving bad advice, and Job questioning things, and we get to this point. And listen to the way God responds. And the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind. If you want to know exactly what that means, you could go ask one of the elders, because I'm not sure. Great image in our minds, but I don't know exactly what that means. But we get the sense that God communed, because it's exactly the same phrase when God and Satan communed together to get this whole thing started. But God is talking to Job and said, "Who is this that darkens counsel by words without knowledge? Dress for action like a man, I will question you, and you make it known to me." Listen to this. I would have chills down my back in a terrified way if I were on the receiving end of this. Listen to the way God responds. "Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. Who determined its measurements? Surely you know. Or who stretched the line upon it? Or what were its bases sunk? Or who laid its cornerstone when the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God shouted for joy? Or who shut in the sea with doors when it burst out from the womb? When I made clouds its garment and thick darkness its swaddling band, and prescribed limits for it, and set bars and doors, and said, thus far shall you come and no farther, and here shall your proud waves be stayed." And he continues for all of 38, saying, "Job, where were you when I made the world? Where were you when I put the oceans in their place and told them exactly where to go and where not to go? Job, where were you when I created all of mankind, when I created the birds of the air and the fish of the sea? Where were you in those moments?" And Job has the proper response of being humbled to recognize that, God, I wasn't there, because you created it alone. And Job is going to go on to this understanding of saying, God, you created everything. And if you choose to leave me in this condition and give me no answers, you created me, I'll return to you one day, and that's enough. Friends, I encourage you, I've got it highlighted on every single Bible I have, Job 38, particularly verse 4. Because there's going to come a day where you're going to have a question, or you're going to get an answer that you don't like or you don't understand. And I encourage you to consider perspective. Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Where were you? Where were I? Where was I? Friends, it changes the way we view our problems when we recognize that the God that created it, that was there, that was single-handedly there, is the one that's in charge of all of the things that I worry about. God is bigger. God is bigger than every circumstance we have, whether we understand it or not. Because there's going to be questions that you and I don't exactly understand. And while I can't give you all the answers to them, I can tell you emphatically with 100% certainty that God is big enough to guide you through them. God is big enough to handle them. If we pray with faithfulness and according to his will, and it's his will to affect change, I'm confident that there is not a circumstance that we can lay before God that he is unable to affect. I'm confident of that. But we look and we understand, and I want to challenge us to be more like Job. We challenge each other to be more like Samuel this morning. Be like Job when you get in situations like this. We go back to our question. How do we handle the unanswered questions, the uncertainty? It's hard. I know it's hard. but I challenge you to change perspective, to not look at life as, hey, here's what I don't know, here's what's not working right, and to shift that on its head and say, here's what I do know. Here's what is working right. Here are the blessings that I do have. And for many of us, it starts with, I know that God loved me enough to send Christ so that I can be reconciled with him in eternity. I know that. If you don't know that tonight, we want to give you that opportunity to change that, to put on Christ in baptism and make that something you know. If you just need prayers or support, we'd love to help you with that too. If we can do anything for you, would you come let us know about it as we stand and as we sing?